Brahms was a great man in the history of music. However, he bore heavily on the well-intentioned words of Schumann, who announced him in his Musikalische Zeitschrift as the new prophet. Like his musical ancestor Beethoven, he wrestled with every work and led the classical symphony to a final romantic flowering. Who was Johannes Brahms and what people and places shaped him? A biographical approach to the century artist from Germany. Johannes Brahms was born on May 7, 1833 in Hamburg into a family of musicians. He grew up in a narrow, poor neighborhood of Hamburg, the later infamous quarter called Gängeviertel. In this picture you can see Brahms' birthplace in a picture from 1891. The house was destroyed in World War II. Because of the poor living conditions, Johannes spent a lot of time in Dithmarschen, his father's home village, 50 kilometers away from Hamburg. The Brahms family owned a house there, and Brahms spent much time with his grandfather. A Brahms Society bought the house in 1988 and turned it into a museum. His father was a professional musician and in the beginning earned his living with small performances in Hamburg dance halls and later became a respected member of the Hamburg Philharmonic Orchestra as a horn player. It so happened that Brahms' musical education began early. He performed in public for the first time at the age of 13 and was subsequently able to earn some extra money for the family. At the age of 20, Brahms' life as artist began. He embarked on a concert tour with a violinist friend. On this trip he met Joseph Joachim, this later famous violinist, who became his lifelong friend and advisor. It was he who recommended that he approach Robert Schumann. Brahms then returned to Hamburg only briefly and left for Düsseldorf to join the Schumanns. Brahms made a stopover in Weimar and visited Franz Liszt. We know what happened in Liszt's salon from an anecdote that Brahms' companion Remenyi passed on. Liszt showed himself gallant and played Brahms' Scherzo Opus 4 at sight. During the following performance of his own great sonata in B minor, Brahms is said to have fallen asleep. This obviously disgruntled Liszt, presumably among other things. So Brahms moved on after a short time. The following trip to Düsseldorf was to change his life forever. Robert Schumann was the artistic director of a musical society there, and Clara was a well-known concert pianist. Brahms was warmly received by both of them. Schumann was impressed by the 20-year-old and published the famous article in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, culminating in the words, "He bore, as well as in his outward appearance, every sign that would announce to us, this is a chosen one." A few months later, Schumann attempted suicide and was committed to mental institution. Brahms decided to move near Clara and her family, to support them, and settled in Düsseldorf. He visited Schumann several times at the asylum and deepened his relationship with Clara. About how far their relationship went is still a puzzle today. Especially after the death of Robert in 1856, their relationship became very close. Their correspondence can no longer be consulted today since the two later decided to destroy the letters. Brahms accepted a position as choir director and music teacher at the court in Detmold during several winter seasons, where he performed several Bach works. Here he worked, among other things, on his large first piano concerto, which he had begun the previous year in 1854. During this time, Brahms met Agathe von Siebold, who had a beautiful voice. He even got engaged to her, but wrote to her, "I love you. I must see you again. But I can't wear shackles." And the engagement was broken. In 1859, he returned to Hamburg at the age of 36. He hoped for employment in his hometown as director of the Philharmonic concerts or as chorus master of the Singakademie, but was passed over for both positions due to the lack of experience. This upset Brahms deeply, and after a first visit to Vienna, he decided to turn his back on Hamburg in 1863. Brahms had a strained relationship with his hometown throughout his life, which even the appointment of honorary citizenship in 1889 and later the offer of the position as director of the Concerthaus could not change. The poor reception of his first great work, the aforementioned piano concerto, probably contributed to this farewell mood. Both in Leipzig and in Hanover, the concerts with the composer as soloist were not well received. At the age of 29, Brahms had visited Vienna for the first time. When he presented his G minor piano quartet at an evening event there, the director of the conservatory and musician Joseph Helmesberger is said to have already proclaimed Brahms the heir to Beethoven. Although Brahms had a hard time with these comparisons throughout his life, he felt valued in Vienna. So he decided to accept an offer as a choir master and moved to Vienna. But Brahms did not last long in the posts and became a freelance artist from the 1870s. It was in Vienna that Brahms met Wagner in 1864. To stage his Tristan, Wagner lived during several months in the Austrian capital at Hadixstrasse in very luxurious conditions, which he could not afford as usual. As always, he furnished his apartment with sinfully expensive furnishings. He received the young Brahms there. However, the two artists, who were so opposed to each other, did not get along and later became antagonists in the culture war between the traditionalists around Brahms and the New Germans around Wagner. Brahms' center of life remained in Vienna until his death. However, he was often on the road and maintained a wide network of contacts. Every year, 3 or 4 months took him to the summer resort to compose. And in the winter months, he was often on the road as a performer and conductor of his own works. Brahms was a regular guest in Bad and Baden from 1863 to 1875. His attraction there was Clara Schumann, widow and former crush of Brahms, who was 14 years young. When Clara bought a house in Bad and Baden in 1862, where she spent the summer months with her children, Brahms set out to find a place to stay so he could be near her. In the first 2 years, he lived in the Hotel Baron. Then he found a place to stay in the form of an attic apartment with the widow Becker. Brahms' abode with the widow Becker, the Brahms house, stands on a hill about the view of which Brahms had raved. Brahms always preferred rather simple and comfortable dwellings for his summer retreats. The house in Lichtental is still unchanged today. Baden-Baden became in these years a summer meeting place of nobility, finance and art, and was even called Summer Capital of Europe. Brahms learned to love Johann Strauss' music there, which he often heard played by the Spa Orchestra and conducted by Strauss himself. He spent 7 summers in Lichtental, and the summer of 1870 had it all. What had happened? Brahms had a crush on Clara's daughter Julie and, floating on cloud 9, wrote the so-called love songs, waltzes. But he was shocked to learn that she had become engaged. He processed his pain with a somber alto rhapsody, based on Goethe's text, which begins with the words "Aber abseits, wer bist's?" If that wasn't enough, Julie asked the preventer groom to be best man, since Julie had no idea of Johannes' feelings. When Brahms had to give his name and his profession in the wedding ceremony, he seems to have spoken so slurredly in his grief that his details were recorded as Composer Brahms. In 1868, the official first performance of the German Requiem took place under the direction of the composer. The place of performance was the Bremen Cathedral. Brahms had already begun composing and compiling the text in his 20s, but the work then lay dormant for several years. Only the death of his mother in 1865 gave the impulse for further work. When the premiere took place 3 years later in the Bremen Cathedral, Clara Schumann and his father were in the audience. The triumphant reception of the work in this monumental ecclesiastical building was a great satisfaction for the Hamburg-born composer, who until then had not received recognition in the north of Germany, and it was one of the greatest moments of his life in the presence of his father and Clara Schumann. The world had to wait a long time for his first. The pressure of expectation weighed heavily on the composer, and composition was difficult for him. The history of the genesis of the First Symphony is also rather confused. Brahms' first attempts date back to the early 60s. In 1868, Brahms wrote Clara the famous birthday greeting with the Alphorn theme from the fourth movement. He had heard this motif played by an Alphorn during his stay in Thun, and had noted it down with presence of mind. It is unclear when he began work on his first symphony, but in any case, he worked on it in Sassnitz on the island of Rügen in 1876 and finished it in Baden and Baden at the age of 43. He deliberately moved the premiere to provincial Karlsruhe, as he was wary of a premiere in Vienna. The work received a divided reception, some complaining about the somberness of the work. Even Clara Schumann was irritated when Brahms played the symphony to her on the piano. Others, such as the famous Viennese critic Hanslick, saw Brahms as a legitimate successor to Beethoven. Hans von Bülow even spoke of Beethoven's 10th, not least because the themes were reminiscent of Brahms' superfather. Even Brahms himself said that any fool could recognize the proximity of the main theme of the fourth movement to the theme of the last movement of Beethoven's 9th. When you listen to the beginning of the Adagio of Brahms' violin concerto, you know how Brahms must have felt in Pörtschach. The theme is so beautiful and romantic that the famous violinist Pablo de Serrate refused to play the violin concerto because the melody is performed by the oboe. When Brahms got off the train in Pörtschach for the first time in 1877, he was instantly inspired, and he enjoyed extremely productive months during several years. In the Carinthian Wörthersee, many works were written. Besides the mentioned violin concerto in 1878, the Sunny Second Symphony was the most important work from these days. As usual, Brahms got up early, took his walk, swam in the lake early in the morning. Brahms was a skinny dipper and sat at his desk after breakfast already at 7 o'clock and used the morning to compose. In 1870, the Vienna Musikverein Hall was opened and quickly became praised for its acoustics. A cavity under the wooden floor creates a resonant chamber, and the suspended covered wooden ceiling provides perfect vibrations. His second and third symphonies were premiered in this venue, both times conducted by Hans Richter. Brahms dared to premiere his second in Vienna in 1877. The plan worked out and it was immediately acclaimed. The contrast with the rather somber First Symphony was great, and it became his most popular symphony. He conducted often in the Musikverein Hall in the 70s and was responsible for the programs for several years. His signature was evident in the fact that he promoted traditionalists and swept New Germans under the rug. The Meiningen Orchestra was one of the best in Europe at the end of the 19th century. The arts-minded sovereign George II, known as the Theatre Duke, promoted the arts, and Hans von Bülow led it to its great flowering from 1880. The two passionately championed Brahms' work, and the composer conducted the orchestra several times in Meiningen and on tours. In all, Brahms spent about 100 days in Meiningen. The Duke also made the orchestra available for so-called workshops, and Brahms' second piano concerto had its non-public premiere here. As a culmination of the Meiningen connection to Brahms, the Court Theatre was the premiere site of his Fourth Symphony, conducted by the composer himself. Interestingly, Brahms' potential successor was present in Meiningen, for Brahms met Richard Strauss in Meiningen during these years, who became Kapellmeister in Meiningen in 1885, succeeding Hans von Bülow. Brahms is also said to have conceded to Strauss, a very nice young man, to his F minor symphony, which was a compliment coming from Brahms' mouth. Strauss, who until then had been a Brahmsian, became a Wagnerian that year under the influence of the concertmaster Ritter, and switched from the symphony to the form of the symphonic poem. Brahms' summer months were his most productive composing periods. Bad Ischl was the place where he spent the most summers, with 10 visits from 1889 until 1896, even every summer. Most of the time he lived on the Salzburger Straße, which was a little outside the town, so that he could take his walks in nature right at sunrise. Then he would pursue his musical thoughts, which he would then jot down in the morning in the Komponierhäusl, in the so-called composer's hut. This hut was located a little outside of Ischl. Although he enjoyed the sociability of Bad Ischl, he also needed his peace and quiet for composing. He didn't always have that, because the innkeepers had many children. In order to isolate himself, he booked 4 rooms. The most important trump card of the refuge, however, was the back exit. As soon as someone who was not to his liking wanted to visit him, he could get out. Here he wrote a lot of chamber music, for he had said goodbye to the great forms in 1887 with the double concerto. He used to spend the afternoon and evening socially, often having visits from Viennese friends or dropping in on other spa guests, such as his friend Johann Strauss. The last visit in 1896 was painful in 2 respects. Because on the one hand, Brahms learned of Clara Schumann's passing. One can see here a photograph of Brahms on the day of the funeral. In addition, jaundice manifested itself clearly, the harbinger of the cancer that would cost him his life a year later. In the second half of the 19th century, the most important artistic dispute in the musical world was between the New Germans and the traditionalists. While the New Germans around Liszt and Wagner advocated the romantic forms of music drama and symphonic poetry, the traditionalists around Brahms and Hanslick wanted to develop the old forms such as symphonies and concertos. Ironically, both groups referred to Beethoven. At the same time as Brahms, there lived in Vienna a New German who didn't want to be one at all. Bruckner was an ardent Wagner admirer, but wanted his peace and did not want to be drawn into the Kulturkampf. Brahms had made negative comments about Bruckner on several occasions, while Bruckner politely held back. One day, Bruckner and Brahms even sat together in their favorite pub, the Red Hedgehog. But no rapprochement took place. The only common ground they discovered when they ordered their meal was that they had the same favorite dish, namely smoked ham with knödel. Brahms made his last public appearance in the Musikverein Hall on March 7, 1897. It was a month before his death, and Brahms was already marked and weakened by jaundice when Hans Richter conducted his Symphony No. 4. There was an ovation after each of the 4 movements. Brahms died shortly thereafter on April 3, 1897, at his apartment on Karlsgasse. According to the diagnosis at the time, he died of liver cancer. Today it's suspected that he had succumbed to pancreatic cancer. He found his final resting place in a grave of honor in Vienna's central cemetery.